Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for the last Beyond the Music series event. Tonight, we're going to go in the story behind the music. This is being recorded, so you can watch it at any time now. If you're watching this, that means that you're watching the recording. So I am really happy to have with us Matthew and MJ, and I'm going to let them do the talking tonight. And it will be hopefully a really fun discussion. I'm sure it will be. They're awesome people. So I'm gonna turn myself off, and if you two want to go ahead and introduce yourselves and then just get started. And I hope that everyone enjoys tonight.
Very good. Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you, Rachel.
Matthew, introduce yourself.
So as most of you probably know at this point, my name is Matthew Jenkins Yarashevitz. I'm the William P. Blair III Associate Conductor of the Canton Symphony Orchestra and Music Director of the Canton Youth Symphonies Program.
Okay, and I am the former director of the Canton Museum of Art, Executive Director Emeritus of the Canton Museum of Art, and currently an adjunct professor in the history of architecture at Kent State University Stark Campus. So we're ready to go. Matthew?
Hey, John, would you mind if you could turn off your video, please? No, you're fine. Thanks, John.
So tonight we have an incredibly informal discussion of the stories behind a number of our favorite masterworks. And we haven't really planned it. There's no PowerPoint for any of you who have attended the music theory series. There's no PowerPoint. We're simply going to tell you a few of the stories behind the music that you know and love, and probably some pieces you've never heard of, but hopefully after this evening, you might want to go and check them out.
Very good. I see, Matthew, when we prepared our lists and we exchanged our lists together, there were a number of pieces that we agreed on that you like and that I like and that fit the category very, very well. And I thought, let's start with a real barnstormer, and that's Wellington's Victory by Beethoven. Just for starters, would you ever want to conduct that?
I absolutely would love to conduct it personally. I'm really into pieces that have bombast and grandiosity. I dare say it fits my personality fairly well. But Wellington's Victory is a really unique piece of music. The Canton Symphony is performing it this season. It'll be on what is now our last concert of the season. It was supposed to be our opening night concert celebrating Gerhardt's 40th anniversary as music director. It's now going to be our last concert, but incredibly unique piece. It is by Beethoven, but it in many ways is completely unique in Beethoven's entire compositional output. It's one of the few pieces in which he uses percussion other than the timpani. And this, of course, being to demonstrate the battle between the Duke of Wellington, who ultimately triumphs over the French forces of Joseph Bonaparte during the Napoleonic Wars. This battle took place in 1813. So in the first part of the piece, we have this incredible use of percussion other than timpani to represent the cannon fire and the muskets and the heat of battle, the likes of which really we had never seen before in Western music. And it was because of pieces like this, pieces around this time when composers were experimenting with the use of the percussion section. It's because of pieces like this, where the percussion was used for a very specific dramatic purpose, that ultimately composers started to incorporate the percussion more regularly into the orchestra going forward into the Romantic period. It also uses trombones. It's also not common for Beethoven. Only 3 of his 9 symphonies use the trombone, believe it or not. And even in those 3 symphonies, the trombones are used very sparingly, not throughout all 4 movements, usually in 1 or 2 movements for each symphony. So unique for Beethoven in its orchestration. In addition, it's a lot of fun. If you know British and French patriotic music, you'll hear a lot of it. It opens with Rule Britannia, If you don't know it by its name, you probably at some point heard bum, 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 ba-dum, bum, bum. That piece right there, quoted at the very, very, very beginning. And then, of course, later, after the victory, you hear God Save the Queen. The French patriotic tune that is quoted here, I actually don't know the French title, but the tune is For He's a Jolly Good Fellow. So a lot of tunes that everybody would know and recognize that Beethoven uses to show the conflict between the two forces, the British side and the French side, and ultimately the British victory over the French.
Well, the backstory on the piece is kind of interesting too, because of course Beethoven had written the Eroica Symphony and got really ticked off and scratched Napoleon's. It's supposed to be dedicated or honored Napoleon, scratched his name off the front page, but he was finagling a deal with a guy by the name of Johann Nepomuk Melzel, the guy who invented the eardrums that Beethoven used for his hearing. But he had created a weird instrument called the panharmonicon. And this was supposed to be a gigantic revolutionary instrument that literally imitated the sound of a full orchestra. And it had everything, bells, whistles, drums, even a violin that played. And he asked Beethoven to write an appropriate piece for that. Beethoven did, and that was the beginning of their unfortunate, unhappy relationship. The panharmonicon was not ready for Beethoven's great piece, and so Beethoven resorted to orchestrating it formally. And I don't think it was ever performed in his time with the cannons and the musket fire and all of that. Yet it became a very popular piece that the two guys had a lot of trouble over who really owned the ownership of that. But it never did make it to the panharmonicon. I'm familiar with that instrument from some weird recordings. But ultimately, I think the first major recording of that in modern times was Antaldarati and the London Symphony Orchestra, with all the bells and whistles and everything that Beethoven called for, cannon fire, all in the score, clearly indicated in the score where the muskets were supposed to barrage and the cannons were to occur. And even musically, it shows the progressive defeat of Napoleon by the willowing away of the muskets and the cannons disappearing in the distance. And then, of course, it ends with a blazing "God Save the King" at the end, which is quite brilliant. It brings to mind one other piece, and I always like to mention this because if you ever want to get really, really close to Beethoven, I mean, like sitting on the piano bench with him, to listen to his variations on various themes. And he did God Save the King as a set of variations. And everybody that likes Beethoven should listen to that piece because it's one of the most brilliant piano pieces that I think Beethoven ever wrote. But so much for Wellington's victory, and there are numerous recordings of it now, but my heart still goes with Antaldarati. I love the guy. It was back in, I think, 1956 or 58 that it was one of the early Mercury recordings.
So another piece that goes along very, very well with Wellington's victory is, of course, Tchaikovsky's 1812 Overture. This was written similarly about the forces of Napoleon being successfully repelled, this time by the Russians. And the piece really, they're kindred spirits because Tchaikovsky, of course, calls for cannon fire in the score. And if you ever get a chance to see the Boston Pops 4th of July concert, you can actually witness the piece performed. They do it every year with the actual cannons. And it's truly an incredible, incredible experience. This time, we have the French forces represented by La Marseillaise, the French national anthem. And it starts out sort of in the distance, in the horns, and then it gets progressively louder and louder, builds up, builds up, builds up, until when the cannons come in, it's the moment of the clash of the battle. The battle rolls on, and finally at the end, in the celebratory music, similarly, Beethoven depicts the battle first and then a great celebration at the end. And this time, Tchaikovsky puts in the low brass the Russian patriotic tune, God Save the Tsar, which of course, at this point, we're beyond the era of the Tsar in Russia, but at the time, that was one of their big patriotic tunes. So the low brass come in at the height, the musical climax of this piece. The low brass come in with God Save the Tsar, triumphing over the French La Marseillaise, which at this point is long disappeared in the piece.
Well, the 1812 was intended to be a big performance for a big industrial exhibition of some sort, and also for the dedication of a Greek or a Russian Orthodox cathedral. And I think that was in 1880 something. It was never performed at that time, and it was never performed in Russia during Tchaikovsky's time with a full implement of cannons and bells. The idea was originally that the cannons all over the place would be fired, and all the bells in Moscow would ring at the ending of the 1812, which would have made quite a din. There were a heck of a lot of church bells. But 1812 had a lot of problems over the centuries. When you mentioned, Matthew, that the Tsarist anthem, God Save the Tsar, God Preserve the Tsar, was incorporated into that. When the Soviet Union came into power, they could not perform, they would not perform the 1812 with that tune in it. And so they extracted it and substituted something else. So when you hear a Soviet recording of that period of the 1812 overture, you will get a real great shock when you expect to hear the God Preserve the Tsar, and you hear something else. And I decided to track that tune down, and there's an irony here, because the tune I eventually discovered is from an opera by Glinka called A Life for the Tsar, and its name was changed to Ivan Suzanin. And the story goes on like that, and finally the Russians decided that they were going to play it the way it originally was, and today you hear the 1812 in its original guise. What troubles me is that that's played every 4th of July, and it has absolutely nothing to do with anything in America. It's all about Russia and the Napoleonic Wars. So go figure.
You know what, though? I have to say, it's fun. And 4th of July, fireworks, cannon fire. Why not? You know,
I'm a spoil sport. I'm a spoil sport. What can I say?
So it's interesting that you point that out about the presence of or absence of God Save the Tsar in the piece, because I had the great pleasure of conducting the 1812 overture at my very, very first concert with the Canton Symphony Orchestra back on Labor Day of 2017, nearly 3 years ago. Time has absolutely flown. It's hard to believe. But 3 years ago, I had the great pleasure of conducting it at my very first concert with the Canton Symphony Orchestra. And when I was studying it, I have a Dover edition that has multiple shorter works of Tchaikovsky in it. And I was very, very surprised to open my freshly purchased Dover edition and see that at the moment God Save the Tsar is supposed to come in, it wasn't there. Now, I, of course, being the diligent conductor I am, I immediately went and checked the parts for the trombones and tuba, and was relieved to see that the Canton Symphony's set of parts had it in there. So I simply took a pencil, wrote the tune in, and knew it was going to be there. It's a great, great, great moment of the piece.
A lot of the pieces that from that time, including works by Tchaikovsky that used the Tsarist anthem, were similarly manipulated. The March Slav uses it, and it's gone in the Soviet recordings. But I think it's all been reinstated as they've come into the 21st century. But a lot of interesting things that happen to patriotic music in different ways. But and those are two good examples.
Absolutely. So wartime has been a great inspiration for composers throughout history. And it is really, it's no surprise, because a war affects the life of everybody in the country, especially something like a world war or something along that scale. And it affects absolutely everybody's life in the country. And from composers to the actual soldiers fighting to the people supporting everybody back home, everybody's life is affected. So it's no surprise that we have so much incredible music, so much memorable music that comes from wartime, inspired by composers living through such times. A piece that I discovered, so as all of you know, the Canton Symphony has not had a performance since February, and I have not had the opportunity to conduct since early March. And it's been difficult, but one of the things that I have done during this time, which has been incredibly rewarding, is I've discovered music that I had never known existed, or if I was aware it existed, I actually took the time to listen to it. And a lot of these pieces, when you're in the heat of an orchestra season, you're responsible for all the music that you're going to conduct or assist in the upcoming concerts, and you don't have time to just sit down and listen to music. And it's been an incredible opportunity to hear some of these pieces. And one of the pieces I discovered was a piece called Poem for Orchestra by American composer William Grant Still. And this piece, it has an innocuous enough title, Poem for Orchestra. It says nothing at all about what the piece is. This was a World War II era piece, and it was written in the early 1940s during the war. And it's about 10 minutes long, and it's in two sections. The first is a highly, highly dissonant section, which William Grant Still was, as many American composers were in the 20th century, William Grant Still wrote lyrical, lush, post-romantic music, really gorgeous, gorgeous music. And so to hear the beginning of this piece, it's quite jarring and quite out of character for him or for many American composers of the time. And he's describing musically what he and really the whole country and the whole world was experiencing as World War II was being fought. And this goes on for about the first 5.5 or so minutes of the piece. And a lot of angst, a lot of drama, and a lot of dissonance in the music. And then all of a sudden, about halfway, just over halfway through the piece, it's like the sun comes up, the clouds part, and you get this absolutely gorgeous, soaring melody. And it was his hope, it was his musical hope that there could be a future of world peace. And it just could not be a more heart-wrenching, I truly cried the first time I heard it. It could not be a more pulling at your heartstrings tune. It goes on for about 4 minutes, absolutely beautiful to listen to. And then right at the end of the piece, we get some incredibly dissonant chords to finish it off. And the very last chord itself is almost a cluster. It's a grading chord, and it was his way to remind us, yes, this is our hope, this is our vision of peace for the future, but we're not quite there yet. And a big reason that this piece spoke to me so much right now was I see so many similarities with what we are going through with the coronavirus. There really has not been an event in American history that has affected the entire country the way coronavirus is, possibly since World War II. And now, of course, I have only been alive for 30 years, so I cannot speak to the intervening years from personal experience. But if I had to guess, and MJ, you can speak to this more than I can. And as a result, so I listened to this piece, and I really, really could relate to what I was hearing in the music and what Still was thinking as he composed the piece. And I was so inspired by it that I have decided to do it this fall with the Canton Youth Symphony Advanced Orchestra in a virtual performance, which will come out sometime late November, early December, thereabouts. So if you are curious to hear this piece by our own Youth Symphony in Canton, keep an eye out for that.
And it's a worthy piece to be thinking about, because William Grant Still is one of a number of African-American composers here in the United States who over the years have gotten very little attention to some of the great works that they wrote. And William Grant Still was quite prolific in the compositions that he wrote. He jumped across maybe two or three hurdles. One of them was writing the music that was expected of him as an African-American to take advantage of the spirituals and the church music, things of that sort that appear so often in African-American music. More than that, though, he wanted to place himself as a composer like other American composers, that he could write on anything that he wanted to without having to be specifically categorized. And he was an experimenter in musical forms, and just brought out a real fine body of work that really deserves more attention. He's written a number of symphonies and a couple of other things. A couple of his works are very, very aggressive, dealing with tragedy of the Black experience under slavery. And the piece called And They Hanged Him on a Tree. You don't hear these pieces, and they come to the fore when you realize what was going on in America with the Black experience, so even during the war years. But I'm glad that you're bringing this man to the fore, because he really deserves to get some recognition.
It is such a pleasure to do so, and he's far from the only composer, and honestly far from the only American composer that I've discovered during this time. Some of which we'll talk about in a little bit, but just sticking on the wartime pieces. MJ, I would love for you to talk a little bit about a piece I know that you love greatly, and that is Shostakovich Symphony No. 7, the Leningrad Symphony. The Canton Symphony was planning to play this piece on what would have been our January concert this year. Unfortunately, obviously that didn't happen. But it would have been an incredible undertaking for our orchestra. It requires almost 100 people on the stage in the orchestra. It is truly a tour de force in every way. It is one of the longest symphonies in the repertoire, on par in length with some of Mahler's longer symphonies. And it's a piece that was written as Shostakovich was hunkered down during the siege of Leningrad, which the anniversary of that, there's I believe the 80th anniversary of the siege of Leningrad is next fall. And Maestro Zimmerman's hope was to perform the piece and have it recorded and do sort of a special on the 80th anniversary of the siege of Leningrad with PBS. Well, hopefully we'll still be able to do this. We may have to celebrate the anniversary a year late, but it was Maestro Zimmerman's dream and vision to do this big collaboration with PBS and to honor the 80th anniversary of the siege of Leningrad.
It is a monumental symphony. It is gigantic, and I think, for my money, looking over the various symphonies of Shostakovich, and I think he did about 15 of them, that this and No. 5 rank outstanding in that large body of work. But the Leningrad is gigantic. It was in part written during the time that he was, in fact, locked up in the city of Leningrad while the German troops were gathering around trying to destroy the city. It lasted for 900 days when the Russians were starving to death by the hundreds of thousands in that city. And finally, with the liberation, and all of that is felt very deeply by Shostakovich in the symphony. That it took that kind of emotion, that kind of a passion, to bring out that symphony and its gigantic movements. Every movement is towering, and I think sometimes it takes that kind of actual involvement in the situation that the symphony is about to bring out that kind of music. There's an amusing story that Toscanini, well, they wanted to conduct that here in the United States, And the score was shipped over here by microfilm to New York, I think. And Stokowski had his fingers on it. He wanted to conduct it. He really wanted to do the American premiere. And Toscanini pulled the rope out from under him and said, no, I'm going to do it because I think I can really do this symphony. And the recording that you could get is the Toscanini recording. But I personally think that if Stokowski had gotten his opportunity to do it, he might have brought a little bit more passion and intensity to it. Toscanini's version lacks the luster that could have been brought out by somebody like Stokowski.
Absolutely. So many composers have been inspired over the years by times of conflict, but many have also been inspired by times of celebration. And so the next few pieces we're going to discuss were all written for various celebratory or ceremonial occasions throughout history. And two that we'll start out with that are on the very top of my mind, having gotten the honor of conducting both of them just before the pandemic, are William Walton's Crown Imperial Coronation March and Johannes Brahms' Academic Festival Overture. William Walton was a British composer, very prolific and sort of unusual. If you compare his music to, in my opinion, my favorite composer, as you probably have all heard me say at some point this summer, is Ralph Vaughan Williams. And Vaughan Williams music, if you want to hear stereotypically British music, Vaughan Williams is a great place to go, especially early Vaughan Williams, pre-World War I. You can just taste London. You can taste the sea, the seaside. You can taste the folk country. All of that very much you hear in Vaughan Williams. William Walton, a little bit less so in a lot of what he wrote. It's British in its own way, but not necessarily in quite the same way as Vaughan Williams. However, Crown Imperial was written for a British ceremonial occasion, and as such, it's a slight departure of style from Walton's personal style and more in line with what you would expect from a British composer. It was written for the coronation of King George VI. If any of you have seen the movie The King's Speech, Colin Firth's character, the king with the stutter, it is his coronation that this piece was composed for. Now, for those of you who have seen the movie, it was not originally meant to be his coronation. Originally, the piece was written, or the piece was commissioned when King George VI's older brother was intended to be the king. If you remember from the movie, he wanted to marry a divorced American woman, and the monarchy said, absolutely not. We will not stand for this. And he said, you know what? I love this woman. I want to marry her. He abdicated the throne, and his younger brother, George VI, became king. And this piece, Crown Imperial Coronation March, was played at his coronation. It is a typical British march. If you know Edward Elgar's Pomp and Circumstance marches, you would see a lot of similarities with Crown Imperial. We have an opening march tune, very marcato, shorter notes, very precise articulation as our opening theme. Then we have our trio, which is a lyrical theme, legato, a little bit slower, a little bit more sparsely orchestrated to start out. Then we get our return of our A theme, and finally the return of the trio, except this time in a triumphal light. Very, very typical of the British march form, and Walton does his duty in fulfilling this commission for the coronation.
I'm not sure that if he was asked to write another march along those lines sometime later, And I think, I don't know if he did so or not, but he said that was enough. The first one was the best, and he wasn't going to try to imitate it. That was it. It was pretty good. You mentioned the Academic Festival Overture, and there's kind of a very amusing story to that. Brahms was invited to come to Breslau for an honorary degree that they were going to impart on him as a doctor of philosophy. And Evan wrote a note on what the award he was going to get to recognize him as the foremost exponent of musical art in the severer style. That was all in Latin. And in order for him to receive this degree in front of the pompous officials of the university, he was to compose a work that would be performed with all the dignity and all the pomp and subtlety that he could muster. He shocked them because what he wrote was the Academic Festival Overture, largely based on college drinking songs. And I know most of them, I could sing them. No, I won't. But they were absolutely floored by that. But he did end it on a very glorious Gaudiamus Igitur, and took his award and went back home and had in his case a very fine overture that could be performed over and over again. And it is an absolute delight to hear, especially if you know where some of the songs come from, the origin of the songs. But they're all good drinking songs.
The ending tune that you mentioned, I don't know all of the source material. I know of course the story behind it, but I don't know all the source material. But if any of you were present for the Canton Symphony's performance of The Freshman, the Harold Lloyd movie where the symphony played the score back in February of 2019, the final tune of Academic Festival Overture made a few appearances in that film's score as sort of a nod to the academic collegiate setting of the film, as well as the Brahms and where the tune comes from. That tune is not a drinking song. Tell us a little bit more about where that tune comes from.
Let us praise, let's see, let us rejoice while we are young in the studies that they're undertaking. Yeah, it doesn't have an alcoholic kind of content to it, but it's a very noble tune, and it's got about 4 or 5 verses to it. Generally, only the first 1 or 2 are sung. That made an interesting, you mentioned appearing in something else. It also appeared in the musical and in the film of the student Prince, where they sing Gaudiamus Igitur, and I think, I forget, was it Sigmund Romberg who wrote that? But at any rate, he has been given credit for composing that tune, and he did not. He just appropriated it and used it in a significant place where they're all singing Gaudiamus Igitur. So a little sneakiness there, but I do love the piece. And it contrasts markedly with the tragic overture of Brahms, and they're just, that's probably the one he should have taken to the Breslau University rather than the Academic Festival.
An interesting thing about the Academic Festival Overture musically, and particularly with regard to the orchestration, it is among the largest orchestras that Brahms ever wrote for. Most of us, Brahms, of course, is one of the quintessential romantic composers, and his style of composition very much reflects that. But unlike many of his romantic peers, he still wrote often for a classical-sized orchestra or an orchestra that was more along those lines. His violin concerto, for instance, double winds, 4 horns, 2 trumpets, and timpani. Really, the only difference between that orchestra and a typical Mozart orchestra is that he used 4 horns instead of 2. And there are reasons for that, which we don't have to go into right now, but he mostly wrote for smaller sized orchestras. The Academic Festival Overture, he wrote for what we know as the standard romantic orchestra. A piccolo and 2 flutes. He really, most of the time, only wrote for 2 members of the flute family, or at least 2 people playing in the flute family. He had 3 members of the flute family, the piccolo and 2 flutes, 2 oboes, 2 clarinets, 2 bassoons, all of that standard, 4 horns, 3 trumpets instead of 2. I believe all of his symphonies only use 2 trumpets. One of his only pieces where he uses 3 trumpets instead of 2. 3 trombones, which do make an appearance in all of his symphonies, but in the 1st and 4th symphony, they're only used in the final movement of each of those symphonies. So even in his symphonies, he's still largely thinking classically when it comes to orchestration. It's also one of his only works that uses the tuba, along with the 2nd symphony. The 2nd symphony is the only of his symphonies that uses the tuba. Tragic Overture does as well. And it's one of his only works that uses a large percussion section. Bass drum, cymbals, triangle, more than just the timpani. This is a fun bit of trivia. The only time a percussion instrument appears in a Brahms symphony other than the timpani is the triangle in only the 3rd movement of his 4th symphony. So he really pulled out all the stops when it came to the orchestra for the Academic Festival Overture. And as a result, it makes it a great piece for me to program with the Youth Symphony, where we're always trying to incorporate all of the players. And the kids had a lot of fun playing it in February and did a really, really great job with it.
That's an excellent piece for youngsters getting interested in concert music. Because as you say, Matthew, it involves the entire ensemble, and it's a lively piece, memorable tunes, and it has as we might say in the day of the pops, that it has a good tune, easy to dance to, but it has a lot of that feel to it. It's really a great piece, a lovely piece.
Absolutely, and it's fun to conduct. It's fun to work with as well. Another piece that was written for a commemoration was Felix Mendelssohn's 5th Symphony, the Reformation Symphony. And it was written to commemorate the 300th anniversary of the Protestant Reformation. Protestant Reformation, of course, started in Germany. Mendelssohn was a German composer, lived his entire life in Berlin. And although he came from a family whose heritage was Jewish, his ancestor, I think his grandfather, converted to Lutheranism, and he was raised in the Lutheran Church, founded, of course, by Martin Luther during the Protestant Reformation. So this piece was a great piece for celebration in Germany, for Mendelssohn and his family. And in it, he quotes 2 notable tunes from the Reformation, from the Protestant musical tradition. One of them, which appears in the introduction of the 1st movement, is the Dresden Amen. Amen. If you know Richard Wagner's opera Parsifal, that same figure is quoted in the overture to that opera, and it appears in many, many, many other places, particularly used to invoke sacred music. In the 4th movement, we get the Bach chorale tune, A Mighty Fortress is Our God. The tune was from even before Bach, but it was really harmonized in the form we know today, the form we would sing in our hymnals today, by Johann Sebastian Bach. A very interesting thing about this is that at the time Mendelssohn was living, the music of Bach had completely fallen off the face of the earth. Nobody was aware of this music. And Mendelssohn sort of discovered it, and as a conductor chose to program it on concerts that he would conduct, which would sometimes include his own music and sometimes include music of his peers. But he reached all the way back into a completely forgotten era and played the music of J.S. Bach for the people of Berlin and made people aware of it. And it was at that point that Bach became a part of the standard repertoire like he is today. So quoting Bach in Mendelssohn's 5th Symphony was another way to honor this composer who Mendelssohn idolized. Another thing musically and orchestrationally that I find interesting about this symphony is that it uses trombones, which were just at that point becoming a more standard addition to the orchestra. Mendelssohn was an earlier Romantic composer, lived in the mid-19th century. So Beethoven had brought the trombones into the symphony orchestra, but they still weren't a mainstay. And Mendelssohn used them in the Fifth Symphony, but only in the introduction for the Dresden Amen and in the finale for A Mighty Fortress Is Our God. And it was a way that he could nod back to the traditional use of trombones, which was for liturgical music. They were used in the church to accompany the alto, tenor, and bass parts of the choir. They would double the alto, tenor, and bass parts of the choir. They were also used in the opera house, particularly to invoke the supernatural, the divine. They've always been an instrument that has been associated with the sacred. And he was nodding, he was tipping his cap to that by only using them for the Dresden Amen and the introduction of the first movement, as well as for the A Mighty Fortress Is Our God finale.
And amazingly, as a baptized Christian with a Jewish heritage, when the Nazis came into power, his music was banned in Germany, along with a number of other composers of Jewish heritage. No matter how far back you went, they refused to perform them, and it was a great tragedy that they did that. They got away with that.
Another piece, MJ, that I know you love, and another piece that I have had the privilege of conducting is Rimsky-Korsakov's Russian Easter Festival Overture.
Love it. He produced that. So far as I could tell, there was no real specific purpose, no occasion. He was not commissioned to compose it, to the best of my knowledge. He just really wanted to compose it. First of all, because he was he revealed a very great skill in orchestration and getting unique sounds out of the orchestra, and he chose a number of old Orthodox Russian hymns, canticles, to incorporate in that. And I tell you, I love the piece. I could listen to it every day if I could. Beginning with the very dark beginning theme, I forget what the tune is that he uses there. But it's an old, Let God Arise, beautifully done, very somberly. And then he sets it through a series of brief variations. But when he gets to the end, there's a little tinkling of the triangle, and right away you know that Rimsky is going to go in for one of his big slapdash endings. And that conclusion of the Russian Easter Overture is blazing. It's just a blazing idea of when the celebration is over and everybody's coming out of church, they've been to the services and all of that, and they are now celebrating the resurrection of Christ. And it is a glorious finale. I just love the piece.
And as you say, it was not written for a specific occasion, but Easter, of course, is the high point of the Christian calendar. Right. Great festival day across the world in many, many, many countries. And what I love about the piece is it starts so solemn and somber, as if it's the pre-dawn hours, the moment before dawn breaks and we declare, Alleluia, Christ is risen, the pre-dawn hours when we're sort of not quite there yet. And then all of a sudden, boom, and the orchestra snaps into, after we hear all these beautiful Russian Orthodox chants, the orchestra snaps into this glorious, rousing celebration that everybody experiences upon coming out of church on Easter, breaking their Lenten fast, and entering a season of joyous celebration. I conducted this piece on the very, very first youth symphony concert that I did here in Canton back in the fall of 2017, and had a lot of fun, and the kids had a lot of fun with it as well. It's another very interesting tidbit about this piece is there's a big trombone solo in the middle of the piece. Sort of, we've already been through part of the celebration and it just stops all of a sudden, and we get this gorgeous somber trombone solo that part is given to the second trombone player. Typically, we would get the principal player in any piece. The principal player typically plays the exposed solo parts. But for whatever reason, maybe Rimsky knew the second trombone player in the orchestra that was going to premiere the piece, was friends with him. Who knows? The second trombone player is the one that plays that solo. It's a famous solo. It's sometimes even asked for on orchestral auditions.
Rimsky also knew that a lot of the people that might be hearing that were not necessarily churchgoers. So he said that the only people that would really, really appreciate that piece in all its glory is somebody that had stayed through an all-night service in a Russian Orthodox church with all the candles and the incense, etc. He said, if you want to really appreciate that music, you had to have been in church for the whole service.
That is incredible. So another inspiration that composers have drawn on throughout history for some of our most beloved works in the repertoire is their own country and their own patriotic feelings for their country. And no composer, possibly no composer, did this quite as explicitly as Bedřich Smetana in his 6-movement tone poem cycle, Má vlast, which translates directly to my country. And it's a glorious set of 6 tone poems, the most famous of which is by far the second movement, the Moldau, which describes one of the major rivers that flows through the Czech Republic. And he starts it off with 2 flutes playing together different parts of the same line. At first, they're separate, representing the 2 tributaries of the river. And as they come together, they start trading off the pieces of their music more fluidly until they're playing one uniform line representing the beginning of the river. He has that glorious famous theme, da 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 da, to represent the flowing of the river. And as the river continues its journey through the Czech Republic, we get various snippets into the lives of the folk of the country, including a peasant wedding dance as one little tableau, and finishing in Prague, in the capital, as it passes the Vyšehrad, the high castle atop the hill overlooking the city of Prague. Vyšehrad is actually the first movement, the first tone poem of the series, an entire movement devoted to this castle. And the main theme, which is first played by the harp, it makes wonderful, wonderful use of harp. The main theme, first played by the harp and then played by the horns, returns at the end of the Moldau to represent the flowing of the Moldau past the Vyšehrad. Following the Moldau going through Prague, it gradually dies away as it continues to flow towards the sea. The third movement of this piece is one of my favorites. Ooh. It is called Sarka, and it is the woman warrior. It's a Czech folk legend about a woman warrior who disguised herself as a damsel in distress, had her fellow woman warriors tie her to a tree, disguised herself as a damsel in distress. When the male enemy army came along, they took pity on her. They released her. She secretly drugged their drinks at dinner, so they all fell asleep. And once they were all asleep, she called her fellow warriors together and they slaughtered the whole company. Has quite a gruesome ending and befitting of a Hans Christian Andersen fairy tale, where, you know, we have all these fairy tales that we know the happy ending, but a Brothers Grimm is who I meant to say. Brothers Grimm fairy tale where they all, at the end, it's a disaster. And the music really, really depicts this beautifully. You hear at first where this lyrical tune where she's tied up, sort of calling out as a damsel in distress. You hear a military march as the army marches by. You hear a celebratory tune as they eat and drink at dinner, which gradually falls and falls and falls, descends in pitch, gets lower and lower and lower, and eventually dies away until you hear this really low note on the bassoon honked out at a very loud dynamic, which is supposed to represent the snoring of the army. At which point the music gets incredibly violent as she calls out her fellow warriors and the slaughter begins.
God, I can see you in front of an orchestra with that piece, Matthew, just waving that stick and having a ball.
Well, I thought about doing it with the youth symphony, but I figured that they would get a real kick out of the story, and it's great music. But I talked it over with Maestro Zimmerman, and he said, in his opinion, it is one of the harder pieces in the repertoire for the orchestra. So I ended up settling on Visharad instead. We played Visharad back in February on the same concert as Crown Imperial and as Academic Festival Overture, and we had a great time with it as well.
Well, Smetana is an amazing composer. He had just been working on a very patriotic kind of an opera, Libusha, and there's a couple themes in there that struck him as very reusable. And it was about that time that he got this idea of creating a series of symphonic movements. He originally had an idea for 4. The last 2, Tabor and Blanik, came as a sort of an afterthought. He had a couple of other ideas, and I'm glad he didn't use them. But those are generally not programmed, and it's a little disappointing that they're not, because they represent a kind of a culmination where the audience has been drawn into all this lovely music, like from Bohemia's Meadows and Forests, just gorgeous. And then it goes into Tabor, which is very dark, very, very dark, with a redundant theme that keeps pounding away through the whole thing. And you wonder, just how far is this going to go? When you get to the very last movement, the mood changes and it's elevated somewhat. But when it gets to the final pages of Blanik, it is some of the most incredible music that Smetana ever wrote, with some of the themes from the very beginning all the way back at the first section, presented here with blazing fanfares and the whole orchestra going off in a huge blaze of glory. And it's worth the wait. And I just have to say, it is worth the wait to get through Tabor and then Blanik. That ending is just absolutely fantastic. It was during that he lost his hearing, very tragic career for him, and death. And that reminded me of a mention to his string quartet from my life that he actually wrote pretty early on in that. He lost his hearing. And I mentioned this just in passing because he created what we would have to describe as an autobiographical string quartet, representing different aspects of his life: the joy of marriage, his fame as now a respected composer, and then the last movement, the rapturous bliss. Everything is going fine until he loses his hearing and he hears a loud pitch in his ear. And I'm not sure what that pitch is. I think it was a high E. I'm not real sure. It's played by one violin in the string quartet, and it's just held. It's sustained, and it shocks you when you hear this. And then from that moment on, the string quartet ends very, very quietly. I like it because somebody we all knew and loved orchestrated that for a full symphony orchestra, and the orchestra was the Cleveland Orchestra, and the orchestrator was George Sell, 1941, and he made his early presentation with the Cleveland Orchestra with his orchestration of From My Life, composed right during the time that my Fatherland was being composed. So a little sidebar.
Another thing you pointed out to me, which I had never realized before, was the opening notes of Visharad are a B flat and an E flat. And this was a musical way of Smetana to sign his initials into the piece.
Well, I'm glad that you mentioned that, because that's missed by an awful lot of people. And I never caught it until reading some obscure thing that it mentioned that he did that. Yeah, that's part of the amusement in music, is when you find these little secrets that are embedded in them. There's initially the music, and then what is inside the music, and then the backstory to these things. And that's the thrill of really getting into all of this music.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's absolutely incredible. We're running low on time. I would like to talk about just a couple more pieces, and one more from the pieces, the patriotic pieces category, and that is one of the best known, Finlandia of Jean Sibelius.
Yeah.
Sibelius was by far the most famous Finnish composer who ever lived, and Finlandia is arguably his most well-known and well-loved composition. And it was written during a period of Russian occupation and oppression in the country of Finland. And as a result, when he published it, it had to be performed under various different names to conceal that it was a resistance piece. But it begins with a lot of dissonance and a lot of unrest. Yes. Uses a large orchestra with a full brass section and lots of unrest at the beginning. But in the end, we get this glorious chorale tune for which the piece is most known. Da, 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 da. It's been turned into a Finnish patriotic song. It has also been turned into a number of hymns that you may find in some churches as well. And it's an absolutely glorious piece that for many years had to fly under the radar as the Russians were occupying Finland.
It was always fun for me to again, getting backstories about Finlandia, because I think I did a pre-concert on this, and I dug through my collection and I found that the celebration that he wrote that for was called the Press Celebrations, and it was done right in the presence of some of the Russian officials. And Finlandia had a very different ending. Instead of that beautiful theme, it's played, but the ending is you got to hear it. It's made to sound like a choo-choo train pounding off into the distance. It's very, very different from what you hear, because he was supposed to represent industry coming to Finland. It's been adapted chorally a number of different ways. I think there's an organ recording. The Mormon Tabernacle Choir sang it as on Great Lone Hills. So there are about 4 or 5 different versions of it, and I have them all for anybody who wants to hear them. But it practically became the national anthem of Finland, but they do have another anthem.
I would like to finish by talking about music, another piece of music that I discovered during COVID, and a piece that was written as a result of a natural disaster that occurred. And that is the Symphony Number 50, the Mount St. Helens Symphony by American composer Alan Hovhaness. Hovhaness lived from 1911 to 2000, and in that time wrote 67 symphonies. He was incredibly prolific, and I was not in the least bit aware of him until this time when I was searching through music to discover and happened to stumble across him. The Symphony Number 50, the Mount St. Helens, was written to commemorate the 1980 eruption of Mount St. Helens. And Hovhaness lived much of his adult life in Washington State and could actually see the volcano from his backyard, from his window. And so he was at home and witnessed the eruption when it occurred. And the piece was written as essentially as a musical depiction of what he witnessed. The first 2 movements, it's a 3-movement work. The first 2 movements are very serene and calm and are essentially his happy memories of the mountain before it resumed as an active volcano. And the 3rd movement, it begins more serene, and then all of a sudden the percussion section comes in. There's an enormous hit, a couple of hits by the bass drum, and the eruption is off and running. And it's really an incredible depiction of a volcanic eruption. Trombones, glissandos, just the whole orchestra gets to have a lot of fun with it. And it's a piece, again, it's never performed, but it's a really, really interesting piece. And it was a piece written to commemorate an event that he witnessed himself, that our entire country, at least those who were alive at the time, remembers when it happened.
Fascinating. And I have to confess that I do not know that piece, but thanks to your information, I'm going to be sure that I have it very soon.
I highly encourage everybody to take a listen. It's really, an interesting piece, very, very unique, and a lot of fun. A lot of fun for the listener and for the orchestra alike.
Well, Matthew, it was great sharing some time with you like this, chatting over music and you know, obviously revealing your love for music and my interest in it as well. We have to do this again sometime soon again.
That
I
was
would, it
awesome.
would be an honor.
Yeah, thank you both so much for doing this evening. I think everyone learned a lot, and I think it's always good to take a step back from just listening for a second, actually talk about the music itself and what was happening behind the scenes with it and why it was written. I think that makes you, the next time you listen, appreciate it that much more. So thank you so much for doing this and for being with us tonight, and thank you everyone for being here and listening as well.
Thank you everyone for joining us. We had a lot of fun, and we hope you did as well.
Very good. Thank you very much, all of you.